August 7, 1944. The jungles of Guam were thick with smoke and the cries of war. Japanese troops dug into coral ridges and hidden bunkers, waited for yet another American advance. They believed they could repel with bayonets and artillery. But on this day, something different tore through the silence. A high-pitched shriek, like steel being ripped apart in the sky, grew louder and louder until sudden fireballs erupted across the ridge. Men who had survived mortars, machine guns, and naval bombardment now faced a weapon they had never imagined. The jungle canopy glowed orange as rockets slammed into pillboxes, tearing them open like paper. Survivors stumbled out blinded by dust and flames, their discipline cracking in the face of a weapon that seemed less like artillery and more like the wrath of the elements themselves. Japanese officers, long accustomed to predicting American firepower, could not understand what was happening. Their maps had no symbol for this. Their manuals had no defense against it. It was as if the Americans had reached into the future and pulled out a weapon designed to annihilate fortified positions in seconds. The shriek came again. This time from offshore landing craft, fitted with racks of rockets angled skyward. The launch was not precise like artillery, nor refined like naval gunfire. It was brutal, overwhelming, a storm unleashed in a single breath. Dozens of rockets screamed together, trails of smoke streaking across the humid air before detonating in waves against the ridge. For the Japanese defenders, time itself seemed to fracture. One moment, they held the high ground with machine guns carefully zeroed on American beachheads. The next, they were drowning in fire and concussive blasts that ripped earth, stone, and flesh apart with equal indifference. To the Marines advancing through the smoke, the battlefield shifted instantly. The ridge that had once been a fortress was now a shattered ruin, its defenders disoriented, broken, and exposed. In that instant, the balance of fear changed hands. The Japanese had been trained to believe in their fortifications, in their ability to withstand artillery barrages that shook the earth for hours before an assault. But these rockets were different. They did not come in slow, predictable patterns. They came all at once, a rolling thunder that smothered defenders before they could even return fire. A single salvo transformed defensive confidence into panic. The noise alone was enough to unnerve even hardened soldiers, a banshee wail in the sky that promised only destruction when it arrived. Survivors later described it as the moment their sense of battlefield order collapsed. Commanders shouted orders into chaos, but the men could not hear them over the detonations. Unit cohesion dissolved as bunkers collapsed and trenches filled with debris. Some tried to crawl out only to be caught in another wave of rockets, their bodies thrown across the ground like ragdolls. The jungle, once their shield, was now aflame. For American observers, the effect was shocking even to themselves. They had expected effectiveness, but not devastation on this scale. Officers watching from the beaches saw hardened Japanese positions, bunkers that naval shells had failed to crack, reduced to rubble in minutes. Marines advancing behind the barrages felt as if the battlefield itself was clearing a path for them. They would later describe the sensation of moving through smoking ruins where resistance had been shredded before their eyes. It was unlike any other support weapon they had used. This was not a precision tool. It was a hammer, and every enemy stronghold struck by it disintegrated. Soldiers began calling them the screaming rockets, comparing the sound to banshees or tortured steel. For the Japanese, the nickname was even darker. They began to speak of the weapons in hushed tones, as if they were unnatural, a dishonorable tool that erased the dignity of traditional defense. On the ridge that August morning, survivors tried to rally. Japanese sergeants pushed men back into firing positions, urging them to hold the line against the inevitable Marine assault. But when the rockets came again, their courage dissolved further. Each salvo felt like the earth itself was betraying them. The psychological effect was as lethal as the explosions themselves. Firepower could kill bodies, but this weapon killed belief. It planted doubt where discipline had once lived. Soldiers who had sworn to fight to the death now hesitated, flinching before the shriek overhead, ducking before orders were given. Even those who fought on did so with broken rhythm, their confidence shattered, like the ridges they had defended. The Japanese command on Guam struggled to comprehend what their men were reporting. Dispatches spoke of new American weapons raining fire in sudden storms, of rockets fired in mass that destroyed entire sectors at once. Officers accustomed to measuring American artillery by range tables and shell counts now found themselves with no reference point. Naval gunfire was fearsome, yes, but it could be anticipated. Its patterns were studied, its intervals exploited. Rockets were different. They came without warning, in numbers too great to calculate, and they shattered entire defense networks before commanders could respond. Reports moved up the chain of command filled with confusion and disbelief. How could such a crude weapon create such devastation? And yet the results were undeniable. Their strong points were gone. Their men were breaking. For the Americans, this was exactly the effect they had hoped for. The rocket barrage was not merely about destruction. It was about dominance. It was about taking defenders who had prepared for months and making their preparations feel meaningless in a single instant. It was about crushing morale before the first Marine stepped into range. Military planners knew this was psychological warfare as much as physical. The rockets announced themselves loudly, terrifyingly, and the anticipation of that scream was often worse than the blast. Japanese defenders began to dread the sound, their hearts pounding before the first explosion even landed. In war, fear is often more decisive than bullets, and here fear became a weapon. The battlefield at Guam was a testament to this shift. In the aftermath of the first salvos, Marines moved through scorched ground littered with shattered coral and burnt foliage. They advanced cautiously, their rifles at the ready, but met resistance far weaker than expected. The once proud defensive lines had become broken fragments, their surviving defenders isolated, leaderless and shaken. Machine gun nests fired sporadically, often abandoned after a few bursts. Bunkers collapsed inward, their occupants buried alive. It was not just a victory of firepower, it was a victory of willpower. The rockets had done what hours of bombardment and waves of infantry often could not. They had ripped the heart out of the defense before the first shot was exchanged at close range. As dusk fell over Guam, the battlefield bore scars of this new form of destruction. Blackened trees stood like skeletal witnesses over ridges that had been flattened. The smell of burned earth and cordite hung in the air. American troops, hardened by months of Pacific fighting, looked upon the scene with awe. They knew they had just witnessed something new, something that would redefine how future battles would be fought. The Japanese, by contrast, retreated deeper into the island. Their confidence eroded, their belief in invincibility shaken. They had encountered a weapon that could not be matched by courage or fanaticism. For the first time, they had seen what it meant for the battlefield itself to turn against them. Delivered by rockets screaming through the Pacific sky. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific War had entered a new and brutal stage. The Japanese Empire, once on the offensive across the Pacific Rim, was now on the defensive, fighting desperate battles to hold islands that had become stepping stones for the American advance. The tide had shifted at Midway in 1942, and by 1943, the island-hopping campaign was tearing away at Japan's outer ring of defenses. American forces were pushing closer to the home islands with every bloody mile, and each new landing brought fresh innovations in firepower and tactics. Guam, Saipan, Peleliu, these were not just names on a map. They were crucibles where technology, strategy, and sheer human endurance collided in the unforgiving heat of the Pacific. The Japanese High Command believed their doctrine of fortified defense would hold. They turned jungle ridges into concrete fortresses, coral caves into machine gun nests, and every natural obstacle into a trap. Their soldiers were trained to endure bombardment, to fight on even when cut off, and to die with honor rather than retreat. For 2 years, this philosophy had made the Pacific Islands battlefields of attrition, where American troops paid dearly for every yard of ground gained. But by 1944, the United States was bringing to bear not just manpower and industry, but an entirely new way of fighting, one that fused overwhelming firepower with speed and coordination. The Japanese had expected the usual rhythms of war: naval bombardment, artillery barrages, and infantry charges. What they had not expected was the sudden introduction of massed rocket fire. To understand the shock these rockets caused, one must look back at the broader military landscape of 1944. In Europe, Germany's V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets were making headlines, striking London with terrifying new technology. But in the Pacific, America had developed a different application of rocketry, simpler, more tactical, but devastatingly effective against fixed defenses. These were not long-range terror weapons designed to hit cities. They were battlefield weapons, designed to obliterate strong points in seconds and pave the way for infantry. For the Japanese, this distinction was critical. They had prepared for artillery. They had braced themselves against naval shells. But nothing in their doctrine accounted for a wall of rockets descending in sudden, screaming waves upon their positions. The Americans, by contrast, were evolving rapidly. Their doctrine emphasized combined arms, the seamless integration of naval, air, and ground forces into a single crushing force. Radios and logistics networks allowed them to coordinate barrages, airstrikes, and infantry movements with unprecedented speed. Japanese forces, relying on rigid command structures and limited communication, could not adapt as quickly. The rockets, then, were not just a weapon of destruction but a symbol of this larger shift. They embodied the American approach, overwhelming, flexible, and designed to break the enemy's will as much as his body. Strategically, the Pacific in 1944 was a war of annihilation. The United States had learned that capturing islands piecemeal, at terrible cost, could not continue indefinitely. Instead, new methods were required to shorten battles and save lives. On Saipan, thousands of Marines had fallen under Japanese firepower that survived days of naval bombardment. On Tarawa, bunkers had withstood artillery that should have leveled them. By Guam, American planners were determined not to repeat those costly lessons. Enter the rocket launchers. They were crude in appearance, racks mounted on landing craft or modified trucks, but they carried a promise, the ability to saturate enemy defenses so completely that nothing could survive intact. It was a promise that, as Guam proved, would change the tempo of battle. For the Japanese defenders, the Pacific had become a war of dwindling options. Supplies were cut off, air support was nearly gone, and reinforcements were scarce. What they still had was the will to fight, the advantage of terrain, and the belief that their defensive tactics could bleed America white. But in Guam, those beliefs began to unravel. The introduction of rocket barrages showed them that even the strongest pillbox was no longer a guarantee of survival. Fortifications that once withstood bombardments now crumbled in seconds. The mental calculation of defense, that one could endure and counterattack, collapsed when whole sectors were wiped out before a counterattack was even possible. From the American perspective, the Pacific Theater in 1944 was not just about winning battles. It was about demonstrating industrial superiority. Every weapon fielded was mass-produced, every innovation scaled up. The Japanese could innovate as well, suicide tactics, concealed fortifications, and clever ambushes, but they could not match America's capacity to industrialize solutions. The rockets were a perfect example. They were not precision-engineered marvels like the German V-2s. They were simple, effective, and built in massive numbers. That simplicity was their strength. They could be loaded quickly, fired in salvos, and replaced without delay. In the brutal calculus of the Pacific, it was the kind of weapon that multiplied American momentum. The psychological gulf between the two sides was widening. Japanese soldiers believed in courage as a shield, in discipline as a weapon. Americans believed in firepower as the great equalizer. By 1944, courage alone could no longer withstand the technological onslaught. The rocket was not the deadliest weapon of the war. Naval guns and aerial bombs killed far more, but it represented a turning point in perception. It demonstrated that America could innovate at the tactical level, bringing to bear new methods that broke the traditional expectations of battle. It taught Japanese soldiers that the battlefield was no longer governed by the rules they had trained for. And once a soldier loses his belief in those rules, he loses something deeper, the conviction that survival is even possible. This was the broader context into which Guam and the rocket barrages fit. The Pacific War was a contest of endurance, but endurance had limits. Japan's soldiers could fight to the death, but death was coming faster and more violently with every American innovation. The rockets did not win the war by themselves, but they were one of many tools, along with carriers, amphibious tactics, and radar-guided firepower, that tipped the balance irreversibly. By late 1944, the writing was on the wall for the Japanese Empire. The question was no longer whether they could stop the Americans, but how long they could delay the inevitable. In that struggle, The sound of screaming rockets became more than just noise on the battlefield. It was the soundtrack of a crumbling empire, an omen that the Pacific was slipping from their grasp. As America pressed forward, the lessons of Guam would be carried to the next islands, each one closer to Japan's home shores. The Japanese still had courage. They still had soldiers willing to fight to the last. But with every new weapon unleashed, from flamethrowers to rockets, the battlefield was becoming less about courage and more about who could shape the very environment of war. And in 1944, there was no doubt. The Americans had found a way to turn the elements themselves, fire, smoke, and thunder, into allies. The secret to the devastation witnessed on Guam lay not in magic, nor in some miraculous superweapon, but in a crude, brutally simple innovation, the rocket launcher. To Japanese soldiers huddled in bunkers, it felt as though the heavens themselves had opened, delivering firestorms that no amount of training or courage could withstand. What they could not see was the source: racks of spin-stabilized rockets mounted on American landing craft, amphibious vehicles, and even trucks. These were the 4.5-inch barrage rockets, a weapon born from America's industrial imagination and rushed into service when the Pacific campaigns demanded a way to smash fortifications quickly and decisively. To the defenders, they were unfathomable. To the attackers, they were a revelation. And to the war itself, they were a glimpse into a new age of firepower. For years, artillery had been king of the battlefield. Heavy guns, mortars, and naval shells pounded positions before infantry advanced. But artillery required precision, calibration, and time. Naval guns could flatten miles of coastline, yet somehow pillboxes carved into coral ridges would survive, waiting for Marines to step into their fields of fire. The rockets were different. They did not aim for precision. They aimed for saturation. Fired in mass salvos, they blanketed entire swaths of terrain with explosions, overwhelming defenders through sheer density of fire. Japanese officers who had studied American artillery doctrine could not comprehend it at first. They had expected patterns, predictable intervals, rolling barrages. Instead, what they faced was sudden, overwhelming violence delivered in a single breath. It was not about carefully targeting one bunker. It was about making the very idea of holding ground impossible. The hidden advantage of the rockets lay in their simplicity. Each rocket was essentially a steel tube, filled with explosives and propelled by a solid fuel motor. Unlike artillery shells, they required no brass casings, no complex firing mechanisms, and no finely machined gun barrels to launch them. They could be produced cheaply by the thousands, in factories already straining under the weight of wartime production. America's vast industrial network, Detroit's auto plants, steel mills in Pennsylvania, assembly lines in California, could churn them out with the same efficiency they produced trucks or refrigerators. What looked to the Japanese like some mysterious new weapon was in reality an industrial solution to a battlefield problem. And that was the deeper advantage. While Japan struggled to replace rifles and ammunition, America could afford to invent entire categories of weaponry and deploy them en masse. The Japanese did not realize at first that these weapons were not precision arms. To defenders inside bunkers, the terrifying sound, the rapid succession of explosions, and the sheer destructive effect suggested a kind of super artillery. In truth, the rockets lacked accuracy when fired singly. But accuracy was never the point. Fired in groups of 24, 36, or 48, their cumulative effect was extraordinary. An entire hillside could be swept clean of foliage, bunkers crushed, and defenders stunned into submission within seconds. To Marines, advancing through the aftermath, it seemed as if nature itself had been weaponized. For the Japanese, trained to fight from concealed strongholds, the discovery was chilling. Concealment no longer guaranteed survival. The psychological effect was perhaps even greater than the physical destruction. Japanese doctrine prized discipline and stoicism under fire. Soldiers were trained to endure naval bombardments, to emerge from bunkers once the shelling stopped, and to counterattack ferociously. But the rockets shattered that rhythm. Their salvos came suddenly, lasted only moments, and left defenders with no clear sense of when it was safe to move. The high-pitched screech of their flight became a kind of auditory weapon. Survivors later recalled flinching at the sound, their nerves fraying long before the explosions landed. Officers struggled to maintain control, shouting orders drowned out by the cacophony. In the jungle, where visibility was already limited, the sense of disorientation was magnified. For men who had once believed in their ability to outlast any bombardment, the rockets introduced a terrifying uncertainty. Perhaps there was no safe moment, no way to predict the next strike. To the Americans, the advantage was more than tactical. It was symbolic of their doctrine of overwhelming force. They were not seeking parity with the Japanese. They were seeking dominance. The rockets fit perfectly into that philosophy. They allowed commanders to project firepower instantly, without the delays of artillery spotting or the logistical complexities of naval gunfire. A landing craft could pivot, fire a salvo, and obliterate a ridge within minutes of receiving an order. A truck fitted with launch rails could provide sudden support to infantry pinned down by machine gun fire. In an age before precision-guided munitions, this was the closest thing to instantaneous responsive firepower. For the Marines and soldiers on the ground, it was a weapon that gave them confidence, that turned the terror of approaching a fortified position into the certainty of overwhelming it. The Japanese never developed an effective counter. Their intelligence. Reports noted the presence of rockets, but often dismissed them as secondary weapons compared to naval artillery or airstrikes. They underestimated the psychological toll. More importantly, they could not replicate them. Japan's wartime industry was already stretched to the breaking point, struggling to produce aircraft, ships, and ammunition under relentless American bombing. The idea of mass-producing rockets, let alone the launch platforms to fire them in coordinated salvos, was beyond reach. In this way, the rockets represented not just a battlefield advantage, but a strategic one. They were a manifestation of industrial warfare, proof that America could innovate and mass-produce solutions faster than Japan could even respond. Perhaps the cruelest irony for the Japanese was that they were not strangers to the concept of rocket weapons. Centuries earlier, Japanese armies had used primitive fire arrows and rockets in sieges. Even in the modern war, they had experimented with rocket artillery, but never on the scale or effectiveness of the Americans. What they encountered on Guam and other Pacific islands was not just firepower. It was firepower industrialized, scaled, and integrated into a doctrine of annihilation. The hidden advantage was not the rocket itself, but the system that made it possible. Factories, logistics, ships to deliver them, and a military culture that embraced innovation rather than clinging to tradition. By the time Japanese soldiers realized what they were facing, it was too late. The rockets had already carved their reputation into the battlefield. Survivors spoke of them with fear, their accounts tinged with disbelief. Some described the sky itself, screaming before the earth opened beneath them. Others recalled entire squads vanishing in the firestorm, leaving no one to carry orders or organize resistance. For commanders, the lesson was equally grim. No matter how well they dug in, no matter how fanatically their men fought, the Americans could reach them with new weapons that made courage irrelevant. That realization, the erosion of faith in one's own defenses, was the true hidden advantage of the rockets. The rockets that shattered Japanese defenses in Guam and beyond were not simply battlefield curiosities. They were the result of years of development, countless engineering hours, and America's unparalleled capacity to turn invention into mass production. To understand their impact, one must look not only at the terror they created in jungles and coral ridges, but also at the machinery behind them, the factories, the specifications, and the technical ingenuity that transformed an idea into a war-winning tool. The workhorse of these barrages was the 4.5-inch high-velocity aircraft rocket, modified for ground and naval use. Originally designed as an air-to-ground weapon for Navy and Marine pilots, the rocket found a new role when engineers realized its destructive potential against entrenched defenses. Each rocket was a steel tube, 4.5 inches in diameter and roughly 6 feet long, packed with nearly 24 pounds of high explosive. Propelled by a solid fuel motor, it could travel more than a mile in less than 2 seconds, leaving a distinctive shriek as it tore through the air. Unlike artillery shells, which required precise rifling and careful powder charges, these rockets could be produced with relative ease, fired in quantity, and replaced just as quickly. What they lacked in pinpoint accuracy, they more than compensated for in volume and ferocity. The launchers themselves came in many forms, but the most iconic were the racks mounted on amphibious landing craft, the infamous LCT-R and LCS-R. These ships bristled with steel rails, sometimes carrying more than 1,000 rockets at a time. When they unleashed a full salvo, the effect was apocalyptic. An entire shoreline could be blanketed with fire in under 15 seconds. Witnesses compared the sound to rolling thunder mixed with the banshee wail of tortured metal. The smoke trails streaked across the sky in unison, creating the impression of a wall of fire descending upon the enemy. On land, the Army and Marines adapted the system to trucks and jeeps, with racks of 24 or 36 rockets mounted on their beds. These mobile rocket batteries could follow infantry into battle, providing saturation fire against strong points that resisted mortars or artillery. Soldiers dubbed them calliopes, after the steam-powered musical instrument, for the way their launches resembled a grotesque carnival of fire and sound. From a technical standpoint, these systems represented an entirely new way of thinking about fire support. Artillery required years of training to master. Gunners had to calculate trajectories, wind, and powder charges. Rockets bypassed all of that. A soldier needed only to aim the rack in the general direction of the target, fire a ripple of rockets, and watch as the landscape was consumed. This simplicity meant that rocket launchers could be operated by troops with minimal training, freeing up artillery crews for other tasks. The psychological benefit was also immense. Frontline troops knew that when they called for fire, the response could be almost instantaneous. In the unforgiving chaos of Pacific Island battles, that speed often meant the difference between life and death. What made this possible was not just design, but industry. The United States had perfected the art of mass production long before the war. Companies like General Electric, Chrysler, and even toy manufacturers shifted their assembly lines to produce rocket components. The SCR-610 radios, the steel rails, the explosive charges, all were churned out by the thousands, boxed, shipped, and loaded onto transports bound for the Pacific. By late 1944, America was producing over 1 million 4.5-inch rockets per year. Each one was a small cylinder of destruction, insignificant on its own but devastating in mass. The Japanese could scarcely believe the numbers. Their own industries, hampered by resource shortages and American bombing raids, struggled to keep pace even with small arms ammunition. To them, the American ability to expend thousands of rockets in a single battle seemed almost impossible, a display of wealth and power as much as military might. The design also reflected a deep understanding of battlefield psychology. The 4.5-inch rockets were not the most accurate nor the most powerful. A single shell from a naval battleship carried more explosive force than an entire rack of rockets. But the rockets achieved something battleship shells could not: saturation. Where a 16-inch naval gun cratered a single target, rockets blanketed whole ridgelines. They came not in isolated impacts, but in storms. For the Japanese, this was a kind of warfare they could neither predict nor resist. Their bunkers, designed to withstand artillery, could not endure the cumulative pounding of dozens of rockets striking in unison. Their trenches, once safe beneath camouflage, were exposed when the rockets stripped away the jungle canopy. Even the underground caves they carved into coral ridges trembled under the relentless pounding, their entrances collapsing under concentrated fire. Engineers refined the rockets constantly. Variants appeared with different warheads: high explosive for bunkers, incendiary for jungle targets, and even smoke for concealment. Each was tailored to the Pacific environment, where dense foliage, coral, and cave systems presented unique challenges. The simplicity of the design allowed for rapid adaptation, something Japanese engineers could not match. Even late in the war, when Japanese forces experimented with their own rocket mortars, the scale and effectiveness were nowhere near what the Americans achieved. Their weapons were sporadic, often inaccurate, and produced in pitiful numbers. In contrast, American rocket launchers became a staple of every major Pacific landing from 1944 onward. Perhaps most telling was the way these rockets were integrated into the larger doctrine of combined arms. They were never meant to replace artillery or naval gunfire, but to complement them. A typical pre-invasion bombardment might begin with battleship shells followed by rocket salvos, then airstrikes and finally mortar fire. Each layer of destruction served to soften the defenses further, ensuring that by the time infantry hit the beaches, resistance was already fraying. It was this orchestration, the blending of old and new, heavy and light, precise and chaotic, that marked the true genius of American warfighting in the Pacific. The rockets were a single instrument in a symphony of annihilation. In raw technical terms, the rockets did not seem extraordinary. A maximum range of 5,000 yards, a warhead of less than 25 pounds. Launch accuracy measured in zones, not meters. But to measure them this way was to miss the point. Their power lay in scale, in speed, and in the psychological devastation they wrought. The scream overhead, the sudden hail of explosions, the realization that no trench or cave was safe, these were the true metrics of success. On paper, they were just steel tubes. In the jungles of Guam, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima, they were the voice of an empire's industrial strength, echoing through the Pacific like thunder rolling in from the sea. For Japanese defenders, the realization came too late. What they faced was not merely a new weapon, but the embodiment of a new kind of war, one where America's factories were as decisive as its soldiers, and where the battlefield itself could be reshaped by technology. The battlefield had become a theater of contradictions, silence one moment, thunder the next. In the waning hours of 1944, the Western Front was a graveyard of machines, men, and ambition. The Ardennes offensive had exposed both the ferocity and fragility of Hitler's gamble. Across Belgium and Luxembourg, forests smoldered, villages lay flattened, and the air was thick with smoke that carried the acrid stench of burning oil and flesh. It was in this crucible that American units, shattered, exhausted but not broken, were asked to hold their ground against a mechanized enemy that still believed victory was possible. Section by section, ridge by ridge, the Allies were fighting not just for terrain but for the morale of an entire continent. At Bastogne, a town whose name would become synonymous with defiance, the men of the 101st Airborne found themselves encircled. Supplies were scarce. Ammunition was rationed like water in a desert. Frostbite claimed more soldiers than German bullets. Yet morale, battered but not extinguished, clung stubbornly to life. General McAuliffe's one-word reply to a German surrender demand, "Nuts," was more than bravado. It was a declaration that this war, with all its sacrifices, would not be surrendered cheaply. For the ordinary paratrooper, that word traveled faster than bullets, an invisible armor binding them together. Each man who heard it carried the defiance into his foxhole, reminding him that his struggle was part of a larger cause. The Germans pressed hard, their artillery shattering the frozen ground, their panzers grinding forward in waves. But their timetable slipped. The Ardennes terrain that Hitler had gambled would provide concealment and momentum instead became a trap. Narrow roads clogged with wrecks, fuel shortages paralyzed armored columns, and American engineers, working with ruthless efficiency, blew bridges, mined crossroads, and turned every village into a fortress. The screaming Mimi rocket launchers wailed through the forest, terrifying yet inconsistent in their devastation. German infantry, once confident, began to recognize the weapon's limitations, but the psychological toll had already been carved deep. Soldiers huddled in trenches whispered about its shriek, unsure when or where the next barrage might land. Above them, when the skies finally cleared, the tide shifted violently. Allied aircraft, grounded for days by winter fog, returned with vengeance. Thunderbolts and typhoons prowled the sky, their bombs and cannons ripping into stalled German convoys. What had been an offensive brimming with momentum turned into a slow retreat, each loss amplified by the knowledge that the Reich had no reserves left to replace what was being destroyed. Fuel trucks went up in pillars of fire, tanks were abandoned where they ran dry, and once proud SS units were reduced to marching on foot, hounded from above. For the Americans, it was a paradoxical experience. Victory was not yet secure, but a sense of inevitability began to take root. Soldiers who days earlier believed they would be crushed now watched German prisoners shuffle past in long, dispirited columns. Some of the enemy were boys barely 16, trembling as they handed over rifles too heavy for their frames. Others were veterans, faces carved with exhaustion, their eyes revealing that they had long stopped believing in Hitler's promises. The war, once painted in bold strokes of ideology, was revealing its human fractures, yet the cost was staggering. Entire companies were erased in days. The snowy fields outside Foy and Neuville became graveyards, where white crosses would one day stand shoulder to shoulder. Medics crawled through artillery fire to drag the wounded to safety, their red crosses both a shield and a target. Chaplains whispered last rites over men too young to die, while quartermasters struggled to deliver boots and blankets to those still alive. The war was no longer a distant struggle measured by maps. It was personal, intimate, a struggle for survival measured by the number of men still standing after each assault. As January dawned, the German offensive collapsed under its own weight. The bulge that had threatened to split the Allied lines was shrinking daily. Eisenhower, Patton, Montgomery all wrestled with strategy, egos, and logistics, but on the ground it was the resilience of ordinary soldiers that had turned the tide. When Patton's Third Army broke through to relieve Bastogne, the 101st did not cheer wildly. They simply nodded, exhausted, knowing they had already proven their mettle. The relief was welcome, but the pride of having endured without surrender burned brighter than any reinforcements. In Berlin, Hitler raged at his generals, blaming everyone but himself. His delusion that the West could be fractured, that Britain and America could be forced into a separate peace, was shattered. The Ardennes had been his last great gamble, and it had failed. What remained was a war of attrition he could not win. The Reich's enemies were closing in from both east and west, tightening the noose with every passing week. For the men who survived the Ardennes, the memory would never fade. The sound of artillery echoing through snow-laden forests, the cries of the wounded carried on icy winds, the bitter cold that seeped into their bones, these became the markers of endurance. They did not see themselves as heroes at the time. They were simply men trying to live through another day. But history would remember them differently. Their defiance at Bastogne, their stubborn refusal to yield ground in the dead of winter, became a symbol of Allied determination. Beyond the battlefield, civilians bore witness to the clash. Belgian villagers trapped in the middle endured hunger, displacement, and reprisals. Some risked their lives to hide downed pilots or share food with American troops. Others watched helplessly as their homes were reduced to rubble, their livestock slaughtered by retreating soldiers. The war that had once seemed distant was now consuming their fields, their towns, their very lives. In their quiet resilience, too, lay a form of defiance, a refusal to let war strip them entirely of their humanity. The Ardennes marked not just the failure of a German offensive, but the beginning of the end. From here, the road to the Rhine and ultimately Berlin was open. The Allies had proven they could withstand the Reich's last thunderclap. Ahead still lay rivers to cross, cities to liberate, and horrors yet to be uncovered in camps that defied imagination. But after Bastogne, after the Bulge, the Allies marched forward with the certainty that victory, though costly, was within reach. As snow melted into spring mud, soldiers carried forward memories of friends left behind in shallow graves. Each step toward Germany was both a triumph and a burden, for in war victory is never clean, never without scars. The men of the Ardennes knew this truth intimately, and it would haunt them long after the guns fell silent. The battlefield was no longer just mud, blood, and steel. It had become a theater of minds. Beyond the ruined forests of the Ardennes, beyond the shattered stone villages of Normandy, the war was entering a phase where psychology mattered as much as weaponry. By 1945, the rockets that had once terrified German and Japanese troops were now shaping a deeper reality. The enemy's spirit was cracking. War was not only about tanks maneuvering on open fields or infantry storming trenches, it was about breaking the will to resist. The Americans, perhaps without realizing it at first, had stumbled upon a principle that would reverberate through every campaign they fought, the ability to project not just firepower, but fear. German and Japanese soldiers both learned that lesson in different ways. In Europe, the Nebelwerfer's scream was mirrored by the sudden howl of American bazookas and multiple launch rocket systems. At first, German infantry scoffed at these weapons, claiming they were inaccurate and wasteful. Yet on the battlefield their tune shifted. Reports flooded into headquarters, describing companies pinned down, platoons scattered, even armored vehicles abandoned because their crews feared the next rocket salvo would land closer. The sound alone, an unnatural rising howl that clawed at the nerves, was enough to turn veterans into men who questioned whether the next moment might be their last. For the Japanese, dug into island strongholds across the Pacific, the effect was even more pronounced. Their doctrine demanded absolute defense, no retreat, no surrender. Yet against American rocket barrages, discipline cracked. The caves of Peleliu, the bunkers of Iwo Jima, the coral ridges of Okinawa, all shuddered beneath rocket fire that shook the very earth. Survivors wrote of ceilings collapsing, of comrades buried alive, of lungs filled with dust as oxygen was sucked out by sudden infernos. It wasn't just destruction, it was annihilation delivered with terrifying unpredictability. A soldier could brace for artillery, could count the rhythm of shells, but rockets came like thunder with no warning, saturating every inch of ground. For the first time, Japanese soldiers admitted in diaries that they feared dying without ever firing a shot, crushed or incinerated by a weapon they couldn't see coming. The strategic impact was unmistakable. Commanders on both sides learned quickly that rocket weapons, despite their inaccuracy, had a force multiplier effect on morale. A pinned enemy is an enemy already half defeated. When Japanese units were smothered by rocket fire, their counterattacks faltered, their coordination collapsed, and their famed banzai charges often broke apart before even reaching American lines. In Europe, German formations that might have pressed an advantage often hesitated. Unwilling to advance into what they imagined was a killing zone of rockets waiting to unleash. Fear stretched moments into eternities, paralyzing decision-making. This psychological dominance extended far beyond the frontline soldier. In the headquarters of Tokyo and Berlin, planners wrestled with reports that their best troops were being unsettled by an enemy that seemed to conjure new weapons from endless factories. Hitler raged at his generals, accusing them of weakness. Japanese officers invoked the Bushido Code, demanding men fight harder, resist more. But exhortations could not silence the memory of the shriek. Fear has no ideology, and even the most loyal soldier could not stop his pulse from racing when the sound of incoming rockets filled the air. Meanwhile, on the American side, the psychological advantage worked in reverse. Soldiers, who once entered battle with dread of the unknown, now felt bolstered knowing that their weapons could shake the enemy before the fight even began. A platoon advancing behind a salvo of rockets walked forward with straighter backs. They knew the enemy was cowering, that the ground ahead had been churned into chaos. Confidence, often invisible, immeasurable, was the hidden ammunition carried by every rifleman who heard the scream of friendly rockets and knew it struck terror in the foe. But the impact wasn't purely emotional. Strategically, the ability to disrupt enemy formations, shatter their morale, and deny them the will to counterattack altered entire campaigns. At Okinawa, rocket saturation turned hardened Japanese caves into tombs, breaking the backbone of their defense before infantry moved in. At Remagen, on the Western Front, rocket-equipped units supported the defense of the Ludendorff Bridge, harassing German troops desperately trying to blow the crossing. In both theaters, rockets weren't just weapons, they were tempo setters. They dictated when battles began, how long they lasted, and whether the enemy could muster the strength to resist. German and Japanese accounts tell the same story in different languages. Letters intercepted by intelligence spoke of exhaustion, dread, and disbelief that Americans could fire so much for so long. One German corporal confessed that he feared not the Sherman tank, nor the rifleman, but the fire from the sky that comes like demons. A Japanese diary found on Okinawa described rockets as the voice of hell, admitting that his comrades no longer trusted their caves as safe havens. This erosion of faith in their strongest positions was devastating. Once a soldier ceases to believe in his fortifications, his mind is already defeated, no matter how deep the bunker or thick the concrete. Even Allied commanders recognized the dual edge of the weapon. Eisenhower noted that while rockets were less accurate than conventional artillery, their ability to unnerve enemy troops made them worth their weight in gold. General Buckner, overseeing operations on Okinawa, described the psychological effect as a silent ally, one that fought alongside his Marines without needing rest, food, or ammunition beyond the endless supply lines feeding the Pacific war machine. The contrast between American confidence and Axis despair became a defining characteristic of the late war. In 1941, German troops advanced with certainty. Japanese soldiers fought with fanatical zeal. By 1945, both armies faced an enemy whose technology, production, and psychological warfare eroded that certainty piece by piece. The sound of American rockets wasn't just a battlefield phenomenon. It was the soundtrack of a crumbling empire. And yet, for all their power, the rockets carried lessons too. American commanders saw firsthand how fear could win battles faster than bullets, how morale could collapse a unit long before its bodies were broken. It was a truth as old as war itself, but here in the frozen forests of Europe and the volcanic islands of the Pacific, it was rediscovered with modern firepower. The battlefield had always been about men and machines. Now it was about nerves, endurance, and the unseen weight pressing on every soldier's heart. By the time victory was within sight, the psychological ledger was clear. German and Japanese troops, once masters of intimidation, had become its victims. Their last offensives faltered, not only because of fuel shortages, poor planning, or overwhelming Allied numbers, but because their soldiers no longer believed they could win. Rockets had played their part in this transformation, not through precision but through presence. Each salvo was a reminder. The Allies had the means to unleash destruction at will, and no cave, no trench, no bunker was truly safe. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the smoke of 1,000 battlefields hung in the memories of those who survived. For the Americans, victory was measured not only in miles gained or islands captured, but in the innovations that had carried them across oceans and continents. Among those, the rocket stood as both symbol and lesson. What began as an improvised weapon, born of necessity and the crucible of war, had reshaped the battlefield in ways no general could ignore. Its scream had echoed from the jungles of the Philippines to the hedgerows of Normandy, from the black volcanic ash of Iwo Jima to the banks of the Rhine. Everywhere it left the same mark: terror, disruption, and the collapse of enemy willpower. The Germans had once believed their Nebelwerfer gave them an edge in psychological warfare. They called it the screaming Mimi, a weapon that paralyzed enemies with fear. But by the war's end, it was the Americans who had refined the art, producing rockets in staggering numbers and mounting them on everything from jeeps to landing craft. This wasn't just firepower, it was a philosophy. The Americans had embraced the idea that war was not only about destroying the enemy's body, but also about shattering his spirit. The rocket was a tool that carried that philosophy into practice, reducing proud armies into fractured units, unwilling to stand their ground. For the Japanese, the lesson was even harsher. Their bunkers, caves, and underground fortresses, once thought invincible, had become tombs under rocket fire. The Bushido Code taught that death was preferable to dishonor, yet the reality of being entombed alive beneath collapsing stone was a fate many soldiers could not face with courage. Survivors of Okinawa spoke of comrades clawing at rock walls as air ran out, of men who once swore to die with honor, begging instead for rescue. The rocket had forced even the most fanatical enemy to confront the limits of human endurance. The legacy extended far beyond the Pacific and European theaters. As the world shifted into the uneasy standoff of the Cold War, the lessons of World War II's rocket revolution echoed in every military staff college. The Americans realized that weapons which shook morale were as valuable as those that destroyed armor. The Soviets, watching closely, drew their own conclusions. Within a decade, the battlefield rocket launcher had evolved into a cornerstone of modern armies, the infamous Katyusha, giving birth to even deadlier systems like the BM-21 Grad. The scream that once terrified German Grenadiers and Japanese Marines became a permanent feature of modern war. But the rocket's influence didn't end on the battlefield. It leapt skyward, transforming into the foundation of the space age. Werner von Braun, the German engineer behind the V-2 rocket, was brought to America under Operation Paperclip. There, his design shifted from weapons of terror to engines of exploration, carrying men to the moon. The same technology that once buried soldiers alive in caves gave humanity the ability to look back at Earth from the stars. It was a reminder that innovation is a double-edged sword, capable of destruction and discovery in equal measure. Still, for veterans who lived through the war, the sound of rockets remained etched in memory. American infantrymen recalled the confidence they felt, hearing a salvo clear the way ahead. German prisoners spoke of dread, of nights broken by the sudden howl that meant annihilation might fall on their position at any moment. Japanese survivors remembered the terror of watching entire hillsides vanish in flame and dust. For them, the legacy was not abstract strategy or technological progress. It was the sound, the shaking earth, the knowledge that nowhere was safe. The statistics told part of the story. By 1945, the United States had produced hundreds of thousands of rocket launchers and millions of rounds of ammunition. Factories in Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago churned them out like assembly line miracles. What had once been an experimental tool was now mass-produced, refined, standardized. America had proven that victory did not require the most elegant design or the most advanced engineering. It required weapons that could be built, deployed, and used en masse. Against enemies who had invested in heavy armor, complex machinery, and fortress networks, the rocket was a blunt but effective hammer. Yet beyond the numbers lay the deeper truth. The war had shown that the battlefield was not only a contest of weapons, but of connections, of morale, of perception. The rocket was unpredictable, chaotic, terrifying, precisely the qualities that made it so effective. While artillery had precision and tanks had armor, rockets had psychology. They preyed on the mind, sowing doubt where certainty once stood. That was their true power. As the decades rolled on, military strategists remembered. In Korea, in Vietnam, in the deserts of the Middle East, rocket artillery and portable launchers continued to dictate battles. The American bazooka gave birth to the RPG, which in turn shaped conflicts for generations. The principle was the same as it had been in 1944, a simple tube, a rocket, and the ability to turn the tide of battle by striking not just the body, but the soul of the enemy. Looking back, generals who fought in World War II admitted as much. Field Marshal Keitel, standing at Nuremberg, acknowledged that German weapons had often been superior on paper. But superiority mattered little when faced with an opponent who could coordinate, mass-produce, and demoralize through overwhelming firepower. "You built weapons that worked together," he conceded, and that worked on the minds of men. It was an admission not of technological defeat, but of psychological collapse. For the Americans, the lesson became part of their military DNA. In future wars, they would invest not only in tanks and planes, but in systems that allowed coordination, communication, and psychological dominance. The scream of the rocket became the precursor to the hum of the helicopter, the roar of the jet, the whistle of the missile. Each was designed not only to kill, but to terrify, to overwhelm, to break the will to fight before the first shot was even fired. And so, the story of the rocket in World War II is more than just a tale of steel and smoke. It is a reminder of the human dimension of war. Fear is as old as battle itself. Yet in the 1940s it was industrialized, mass-produced, and unleashed with a fury that no soldier could ignore. The rocket was both crude and revolutionary, a weapon that bridged the gap between ancient terror and modern mechanized slaughter. When the world remembers the Second World War, it recalls the great tanks, the mighty bombers, the vast fleets. But in the trenches, in the caves, in the ruined cities, the men who fought remembered something else: the sound of rockets, the earth trembling, the knowledge that death could come screaming out of the sky at any moment. That was the rocket's legacy. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is this: in modern war, victory is not granted to those with the strongest armor or the heaviest guns, but to those who can shape the battlefield in the mind of the enemy. Connection outweighs firepower. Speed defeats strength. And fear, once unleashed, can be more decisive than any bullet.